as a Democrat, became paralyzed to know what to do. Could we remove Assad without giving the country to a radical group like ISIS-ISIL? If we couldn't, then we weren't sure what to do, and we had some options, as we'll see in a minute. This was a perception of U.S. weakness, and ISIS-ISIL then filled the vacuum and has been changing the map ever since. Call this the withering of the American dream. The Shia government under most recently al-Maliki, although he's out of power and a new Shia leader is in, they have failed to agree to the idea of power sharing. This has led to smoldering feelings of frustration by the Sunnis, by the Baathists, that is those that were in Saddam's party, and Iraqi Sunni soldiers who then gave up their weapons to ISIS-ISIL rather than fight them. As we said, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are related but not the same. Al-Qaeda's goals were more modest. Al-Qaeda is more of a religious-based organization, movement. It's heavily donor-based, which is one of the weaknesses of it. And its goal was more modest, withdrawal of American forces, and to take advantage of the catastrophic rise of corruption in the Iraqi military. ISIS's goal, as we said, is to dissolve the boundaries entirely, to recover this glorious Islamic caliphate idea. It's a movement that is less religious than Al-Qaeda, although there are religious persons within the group, but there are also people with no religious sensibilities. There's what someone said to me, there's also a bunch of thugs, and I said, yeah, they're there too. ISIS-ISIL is much more willing to let whoever wants to use their flag use it, because then they get more in the headlines. So they're not as careful about who's in the movement. In a way, ISIS-ISIL is the child of Al-Qaeda. The two can cooperate at times, and sometimes we thought in the Paris attacks that they might have been competing. There was there was two events over 3 days, I think, in Paris. And the first one was linked up to Al-Qaeda, and the other one was linked up to ISIS-ISIL, or vice versa. And then we began to think, well, maybe it was coordinated. So there is some competition in Syria and in Iraq. There's more radical groups than ISIS-ISIL. They're just the best known and the most successful, the best organized. They really have their act together. There's three competing narratives. To talk to Shia at this time, history is finally going the way it should. So if you're a Shia in this region, Iraq now has a Shia government, Syria has a Shia leader, and Lebanon has the Hezbollah. You have what's called a Shia arc right in the middle of the Middle East. Like, they've never had this before. So history for them is great. The ISIS narrative is a revived caliphate will finally correct the humiliation and the damage done by colonialism, America's venture into Iraq, which turned the nation into a Shia-controlled nation, and the most recent spread of what they consider the Shia heresy. So this is important for us to know that the number one enemy or the opponent on ISIL's list is Shia. That's the goal, is genocide and killing all the Shia in the world, in a sense. We're on that, Christians are on that list, Americans are on that list, Yazidis are on that list, but we're down the list. We're not the primary focus of this group. Kurds are on that list, but the main group that they want to attack are Shia. And they're very hard on them when they take a village with Shia in it. As I said earlier, the U.S. narrative was based on a hope that there would be a power-sharing democracy of diverse groups. something like what was achieved in Northern Ireland. If you remember, at a certain point, Northern Ireland kind of bled out and they moved. It wasn't that Sinn Féin went away or the IRA went away. They became parties within the political spectrum of Northern Ireland. They still fight, but now the fighting is verbal rather than the blood of the previous times. And so the hope was, well, if the Sunnis and the Shia could become political parties in Iraq, they could continue their argument, but they would do it within political boundaries in which people aren't being killed. So that was our hope. And if that would succeed, maybe Afghanistan and Iraq would be just the beginning of a change in the whole region. That was our hope. Just when we thought things couldn't get worse, the last 2 months in Yemen, down here, Saudi Arabia is a very right-wing fundamentalist form of Sunni theology called Wahhabism. So they want to exert they're a huge nation, right? So they want to exert their power over the region. Their opponent is Iran, so they're Sunni and they're Shia. Notice it's also a pretty big chunk of the map. And Iran also wants to be the power broker for the region. And what's happened in Yemen is that the north part of Yemen has now come under the control of a group called the Houthis, and they are Shia, funded by Iran and Russia. Below them in Yemen is Al-Qaeda and ISIL, which has some support from Saudi Arabia, the Sunni nation. So we have what we call here a proxy war, and that is Saudi Arabia and Iran are in the process of destroying Yemen to fight each other without actually fighting each other directly. American options. If Iraq has a functioning power-sharing government, which was our plan, the U.S. had a beachhead of Western-style democracy, democratic values and ideals in the center of a very troubled region. We could change the map in a more peaceful way. Questions. Is Iraq committed to this future? Well, they haven't done power sharing yet. We'll skip the corruption issue and go down to the last one. Iran, next door to them, is completely Shia. They love the fact that there's a Shia government in Iraq next door. This is wonderful. It's they have no motivation for a power-sharing government next to them. So Iran would oppose that, the American goal, the American dream. Option two, if Iraq had this dream that we had, and that would end with Assad's ouster, who will rule Syria? ISIL or democratically inclined rebels? Lebanon's already been drawn into the Syrian civil war. Iran and Russia support Hezbollah and Assad, and primary reason why Assad is not folding is he's just being propped up by Iran and Russia. The most embarrassing thing I could say is in the last point at the bottom. This was just revealed 2 weeks ago, and that is that we had pumped $500 million into the training of democratically inclined rebels who we hoped could defeat Assad and then turn and defeat ISIL. There was a recent admission that the numbers were under 10 that we had trained. $500 million. We cut off that program. Option three involves the Kurds who live in the north of Iraq, the north of Iran, and the south of Turkey. They are great fighters. They've had impressive victories against ISIL. They always are saying if the U.S. would give more military aid, we could do great things. The issue that has arisen is that the Kurds have a goal, and that is we've never been allowed to have our own nation. Sound familiar? We haven't been allowed to have our own nation, and so they're fighting with the idea that at the end of this, should ISIL be defeated, America owes them a nation. Iran says no, Iraq says no, and Turkey says no. And then we have something that happened again in the last 3 weeks that has been distressing, and that is, you may have read this, that Turkey, up until 3 weeks ago, had not allowed American planes to use their airfields against flying into Syria and Iraq against ISIL encampments. The Turks didn't want to allow that because they had sympathizers within Turkey, which is also Sunni, and they didn't want to promote a lot of violence at home. 3 weeks ago, all of a sudden on the news, Turkey is going to allow American planes to fly out of their airfields. I'm thinking, that's a complete turnabout. And then a week later, I felt like the other shoe dropped. Turkey began to bomb the Kurds, claiming that they were bombing terrorist Kurds. Makes you wonder, was there a deal struck? You can use our airfields, but you're going to turn a blind eye when we now attack Kurds. Kurds have been our strongest allies in this region. It's one of the things I agree with Donald Trump on. One. That is, we have treated the Kurds shamefully. American option 4, can we bankrupt ISIL? Now this is hard. Al-Qaeda you could bankrupt because you could freeze the assets of donors. And we did that. The problem with ISIL is that they're much more self-sustaining and they're not so donor-based. One of the examples that I use, if Al-Qaeda 5 years ago could take an oil field in northern Iraq, they never felt that they could keep it because Al-Qaeda never saw itself as a nation builder. And so they would have destroyed the oil field just to harm the Iraqi government and the American presence. ISIL takes an oil field in northern Iraq and they keep it running, and up until 8 or 9 months ago they were selling oil on the black market, primarily to Turkey, for $3 million a day. They have an economy. When they go into a town, of course, they empty the bank vaults. If they capture foreign nationals, they will sell them to countries that are willing to pay. And so they have, in fact, they're going to mint their own currency, apparently. That's their next step. So they have a kind of an impressive business plan. They're very sophisticated. There are some obviously donors, but they're well organized. They're more self-sufficient than Al-Qaeda. It's going to be harder to economically, tie them up. Another question is, will patience on our part and overreaching on their part reverse the current trend? This actually might have some hopeful pieces to it, and that is ISIL is primarily trying to attract 18 to 29-year-old young people from around the world. 90 nations have contributed fighters for ISIL, including the United States, Australia, France, Britain, a lot of Western powers. And the appeal is pretty direct. They are very much tuned into the video game culture of young men in the West. And so one of the things they put on their tweets, apparently they do 20,000 tweets a day. I mean, they're just all over the place. And one of the things they say is, you have played the game, now come join the game. And so if someone comes from the West and flies to Turkey, crosses the border into Syria, joins them, the first thing they'll do is put them on a computer to communicate with their friends back home that they know are unhappy. And tell your friends this: there is a plane ticket for you, and there is a job with salary to come join us, because they pay their soldiers. Al-Qaeda, we don't think did that. Al-Qaeda, you were fighting for God. But ISIL, it's a job and there's pay. And when we see, particularly not so much in the West, but when we look at the fact that unemployment of young people in many Muslim countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for example, and the Middle East is up to 50%, here you have someone saying, come join us and you'll get a paycheck. They're even to the point now, this is very recent, in which they're encouraging families to come. Bring your wife, bring your kids. Here's what your life will be. During the day, you get to go out and kill God's enemies. At night, you get to sit around and have a just family life. So they're constantly revising their strategies. Something we could talk about maybe later is that the beheadings have actually helped their recruitment, which is terrifying. And so there's a motivation for them to continue. It makes them look like a serious group. And if you've ever seen recent video games, as I did over fall break, visiting my grown sons, watching this thing in horror as these heads explode. And it's not just killing someone, it's dismembering the enemy. There's some ways in which what ISIL puts out as propaganda videos looks a little bit like a video game, including some of the same kind of music. So they're going to be more difficult, but it is possible that their hubris, their belief in themselves, they'll overreach. Because one of the things we know is that it's like a kind of a pyramid scheme. They're an exciting group to join because they can promise that if you join us, you can help change the map. You can change history. And they can prove that by showing how the map has changed. The problem is that after the battle is over and ISIL controls a village, it's a terrible place to live. It's very restrictive. Women's lives are terrible, and men, it's very much like the way the Taliban ran Afghanistan before we invaded, and that is, it's a nightmare to live underneath their control. So it's exciting as long as you're on the front lines. Here's something that I've been working on, and it's probably the most controversial thing that I'll share with you, and then we'll open it up for questions. Is there anything we can do? Well, I've been giving this talk around the country, sometimes to Muslim groups, a lot of times to churches, and usually it's with churches that they'll ask at the end, what can I do? And so coming out of Shoulder to Shoulder and Interfaith Witness, which was a program that we started with Interfaith Forum of Columbus back in 2012, we have a new program called Prayer Partners for Peace, combating ISIL with prayer. So this is kind of just a couple slides about this. One of the recruiting strategies of this group is to encourage Muslim youth living in the West who are interested in them through online avenues to cut off all contact with the local mosques. That's a demand. The rationale for this is obvious. Mosques all over the world, as I was told in Parliament of World Religions when I gave the same presentation, mosques all over the world are almost in total agreement in opposing ISIL. They believe it's a distortion of the message of Islam. The great majority of devout Muslims in the West want nothing to do with ISIL and are trying desperately to prevent their youth from being seduced by this and other radical groups. This has been particularly a problem up in Minneapolis, St. Paul with the Somali community. They've had a number of youth that have left and have been killed in the war. And so they have a program between the police force and the mosques to try to intervene in the lives of young men. Young men 18 to 29, some of you are in this age range. Impulse control is not at the best during those years. And so they know what they're doing. So our program, this Prayer Partners for Peace, is that we believe the best antidote to combat ISIS's radicalism is to strengthen mosques in the West. This is very counterintuitive to many people who would like to say, well, maybe if all Muslims left America, we'd be in better shape. Actually, the most damaging step that American Christians can take is to participate in Islamophobia, and there's a number of very prominent so-called Christian leaders who are promoting Islamophobia and the spread of intolerance and hatred of Muslims. Events such as the recent rally in Garland, Texas, which encouraged disparaging cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, are, in my opinion, not free speech rallies, but hate speech rallies. The message is clear at these events. Muslims are not welcome in America. Ironically, no one benefits more from these programs than does ISIS-ISIL. ISIS portrays America and the West as unwelcoming places for Muslims to live. ISIS knows when they behead somebody or when there are stories of sexual abuse of Western women that they capture. One of the reasons that we know that they do it is that they know that Muslims in the West will be harassed after these stories come out, because most Americans don't know the difference between the majority of Muslims and these radical groups. So ISIS-ISIL deliberately puts out these outrageous events in order to make life for Muslims in the West unbearable, because ISIS-ISIL wants all Muslims to return to the Middle East. Unfortunately, so do many right-wing Christian groups. So our initiative links Muslims and Christians in a battle against ISIS-ISIL. We believe that strong mosques in the West help defeat this group by crippling their recruitment efforts. We believe that Christians can play an important role in strengthening and encouraging our Muslim neighbors. This we know, prayer is powerful. We also know this is particularly true in the Muslim community where prayer is obligatory 5 times a day. We also know that devout Muslims are people of prayer, as are committed Christians. Our program encourages individual Muslims and Christians to pray for one another, but not in secret, to pray for one another and let the other party know that you are praying for them or you're asking them to pray for you. Our initiative encourages not only individuals, but faith communities, Muslim and Christian faith communities in the same locale to pray as congregations for one another. We have tried to suggest that there's a prayer that is universally acceptable. And that is, it's acceptable to those that believe that the answer is for every Muslim to get to know Jesus as personal Lord and Savior. And it's applicable for Muslims that believe that the whole salvation of the world is if everybody becomes Muslim. And then all groups that aren't at those point, but the prayer we share is a simple one. Can we pray that God's will be done in our neighborhoods, our country, and our world? Can we trust God to help us understand how we're going to live together? I've had an opportunity to share this idea at a National Muslim Convention in August in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They stopped my talk with applause. When I was a kid, many years ago, I remember older people in my church who would say this phrase, "We'll see each other next week," and they would, "God willing." I rarely hear that anymore, and I hang around a lot of Christians because I am one. I don't hear that much anymore. Who I hear saying it are Muslims. Inshallah, one of those forms. Behind every plan, proposal, they add, "God willing, God willing." And my spiritual friendships with Muslims that have developed over the past couple of years has led me to believe that many Muslims in America are spiritually quite lonely. They came for the same reason my immigrant grandparents came, for opportunities for their kids to have better lives, all those things. But as an Egyptian scholar commented to me, a Muslim scholar, he said, "I expected to see more people who reminded me of Jesus." And so the privatization of faith in America, that prayer is mainly a private thing, which means it's an invisible thing for the community. Whereas if you're in a Muslim country and it's a time of prayer, the taxis stop, everybody jumps out, and that's the time of prayer. And so it hasn't been surprising to me to realize that many American Muslims feel closest to monks and nuns who have a prayer divine office program that they pray through the day. And so they sense that these are praying people. I remember one woman that Christian who got a Fulbright scholarship to, I think it was Indonesia, which has the most Muslims of any country in the world. And she was staying with a Muslim family. And when the mother in the family would go for her prayers, then this Christian woman would go into her room and pray. Well, after a while, when people would come over to the house, the Muslim woman would introduce the American person staying and say, "She's a praying Christian," as if that was a rarity. She's a praying Christian. And then this woman shared with me through her tears that a couple of weeks later, a Muslim woman came to her and said, "Can you help me with my prayer life? I have these dry periods where I don't feel like anything's happening." And the Christian woman told me, "No Christian has ever asked me advice about prayer." But I was known as the praying Christian woman. So one of the things that we have found is that whether you like this idea or not, that Muslims are very touched and relieved that there's Christians praying for them. And I think I have no problem asking for their prayers that we don't, as Christians, I'm speaking for myself, I'm not assuming you all are, that we don't fall into hatred of Muslims and Islamophobia in all its forms. So, right, at this point I'd love to just open it up for questions and comments. I do not have all the answers, trust me. I'm learning all the time. Do you remember that commercial with the Marines where it says some people run away from crises and some people run toward when they show up? And so I had been teaching a course on religion and violence for 12 years, and a year and a half ago I had a conversation with myself, and I thought maybe I'll just stop. Al-Qaeda was kind of weak. And then ISIL came on the screen, and I thought, maybe I need to run toward this because it's going to be really hard to understand, and if I can help anybody. So I hope that some of your confusion has been reduced. I don't believe our fear is necessarily reduced. This is a great challenge. Some people ask me, will American forces have to go back in? And I know two things. ISIL wants us to go back in because it'll help with recruitment, because it'll look like another Western intervention to control the region. But secondly, I don't believe that this can be solved with the nations in the region. They do not have the will, the resources, the lack of corruption. And so I think it's possible we're going to have to go back in. Yes, sir.
Could you go back to your slide about getting history right? It says something about the Shia-Sunni split, and that at its core is trying to stop the others. No, getting history right. It was the top.
That's a different slide.
Yeah.
It's much after this, well after this. Keep going.
This is dehumanization, putting history
That's
right.
history right.
No, it was the very top line. Keep going, it was only on. There it is.
You were right.
There you go. The second paragraph, and the more recent spread of Shia's distortion of Islam.
In ISIL's point of view as a Sunni radical
Can
group.
you elaborate on that? I don't understand why one views the other as distorting Islam.
Basically, one of the ways I understand this situation is to go back in European history to right after the Reformation, in which we're in a period of the 30 Years' War. If you were in Northern Europe, you were Lutheran or Calvinist, and you were sending troops to fight against the heresy of Catholicism in the South. If you lived in Southern Europe, you were Catholic, and you were fighting against the heresy of the Reformers in the North. 30 years, Europe bled out. And we came to the realization that this could be endless. When you lose a battle for your interpretation of God's will, you don't give up your interpretation. You believe that you need to get stronger because God's will is God's will, and God's truth is God's truth, and your group has it and the other one doesn't.
Because of the leadership doesn't descend from Muhammad? Is that where they get?
So I'm going to apply that.
That was the question. Did you turn?
Yeah, but I didn't.
So part of being a Shia is to believe that there are verses in the Quran that the Sunnis took out. Part of being a Shia is to identify your heroes as two figures, Ali and Hussein, very early in Islamic history, who were assassinated by Sunnis. They have a martyr cult in Shia, and the perpetrators are the Sunnis. So part of their story is the Sunnis have shanghaied Islam, have violated what the Prophet wanted in terms of leadership, have killed these two almost Christ-like figures in their martyrology, Ali and Hussein. In fact, one of them has, I forget, one of them almost like gives his life sacrificially for the Shia community. So this is different than Missouri Synod Lutherans not agreeing with the LCA Lutherans. This is, each group sees the other as having distorted. Now, part of the issue is the understanding of the Quran as a heavenly document. So one of the things that Muslims believe is that there are other peoples of the book, Jews and Christians. The Jews were given a revelation through Moses and the prophets, that in sort of Islamic understanding, Jews became too preoccupied with small details rather than mercy and justice. Jesus was given a revelation that is valid as a prophet. But Muslims point at the New Testament and say, your four Gospels don't even agree. It's not a divine document. Whereas the Quran then comes 500-600 years later as a document that was, in a sense, dropped from heaven from Allah through Gabriel to Muhammad, the illiterate person who then recited it and it was written down. So it's taken as a perfect